make some room.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like. On the tipping top of the world.
Unreasonable refusal to deal with respect to vessel space accommodations. To deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations, it's closed for comments. We covered the rulemaking a few weeks ago. This is the rulemaking put out by the Federal Maritime Commission. We covered the Department of Justice comments last week. Let's talk about some of the other comments filed. There were a lot. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. Story number 1. So the Federal Maritime Commission released their detention demurrage rule on October 13th. I mentioned it every week. I will continue to mention this until it closes. This will be on my top 3 stories of the week. It's that important. The Federal Maritime Commission released their detention and demurrage rulemaking. It's the notice of proposed rulemaking stage. We went into detail on this D&D NPRM, the notice of proposed rulemaking, a few weeks ago here on By Land and By Sea. Like I said, I'm going to keep it on my top 3 stories of the week here to keep reminding people that it's still open. It will still be open for just over another month. I mean, really like 6 weeks. Open through December 13th. Don't forget, though, we have Thanksgiving for those of us in the U.S., so you're looking at probably like a month, and I mean, we're right in the season of let's take care of this after the holidays. We're keep pushing on this D&D rulemaking, December 13th. We need comments in. Remember, this is through the new regulations.gov. This will no longer be hosted on the FMC website directly, but rather you'll file your comments through regulations.gov. A little bit of a nuance, but I think it kind of streamlines things, and they also send you email updates whenever there's new updates to the reg. So again, this is the detention and demurrage notice of proposed rulemaking. It's open. It really is trying to streamline contractual relationships for invoice payments. It proposes to have motor carriers taken out of the responsible parties list, but it includes them as they may pay. It also introduces a 30-day invoice deadline or due date, with then a 30-day of the billed party, the receiver of that invoice, having 30 days from the date of receipt to file any sort of dispute resolution or any disputes against it. That might be something interesting to talk about in your comments. So often, even though the invoice is due, in this, it's being proposed to be due 30 days after the demurrage and detention had concluded. I mean, often you're required to pay that bill before you're even allowed to pick up the goods. Maybe that's something to mention, like this 30 days is good, but however, maybe talk about what happens when I have to pay this bill to even have my cargo released. These are things they want to hear. They want to hear from the industry. They want to know how do these proposals work? This is one of the last true good moments. You'll have final rule after this, but really this is kind of one of those last true good moments before they come out with some real language on this. So get your comments over to the FMC on this. Story number 2. We don't really have a lot of movement on the ILWU, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, and the Pacific Maritime Association, the PMA contract negotiations. Other than this week, the Port of Oakland was actually shut down due to protesting workers. I'm treading lightly here, so I'm just reporting it as having happened. It's been casually mentioned that we're still probably months away from a new contract. I think everybody would really love to see a new contract come in here. Again, this is the ILWU and the PMA contract negotiations. Look, the East Coast ports are actually still, standing to benefit from the delayed contract. As we've talked about, we went over in one of the previous episodes of By Land and By Sea. a look at the ILWU and the Pacific Maritime Association's kind of storied history, but we also talk about who the ILWU is and who they're not. They're not the ILA, the International Longshore Association, which is generally the ILA is generally the East Coast port labor, and the ILWU is the West Coast. Really interesting stuff. Everybody's continuing to watch this. I will continue to watch this. I'm interested to see what happens after the Port of Oakland protest this week. We'll see. We'll continue. I don't think anybody wants the ports to shut down. The workers the ILWU have even said that they don't want to see the ports shut down. But labor negotiations are tough. There's a lot that could happen. So continue to watch that. Story number 3, Drury released information today, actually, highlighting the cancellation rate of sailings. So ocean carriers will transit the world, and it's reported that they have 734 scheduled sailings for the weeks of 45 through 49 in the year, so basically the past few weeks. The Drury's reporting that 100 sailings were canceled during that time. And sometimes these cancellations could be, and I think mostly they're touted as operational cancellations, potentially not enough cargo going to wherever they're going. These are the blank sailings that we hear about. But Drury's saying that this represents a 14% cancellation rate. So ocean carrier sailing is liner sailing, which is a regularly scheduled service. And only liner service enjoys this antitrust immunity. So through the Shipping Act, administered by the Federal Maritime Commission, they are allowed and challenged with granting these antitrust immunities, which is why we have alliances. And so we've talked about this on By Land and By Sea before, but alliances are essentially similar to the airline alliance, supposed to be an expansion of services offered by these collectives, so these alliances. They're not allowed to talk about rates, but they can vessel share. They can share some of those operational struggles. And the thought was that it was going to provide better service for the importers, exporters, and American consumer. And so that is antitrust immunity. Otherwise, that would have otherwise been kind of cartel-y. I mean, I've come out against saying that they're not cartels. Well, there is some monopolization to it. There's no rate discussion, but this is allowed in a limited way through the Federal Maritime Commission by the FMC watching all of this. And so all of this is background to say it's a regularly scheduled service that enjoys this. But at what point does that 14% cancellation rate, what does that turn into non-liner service? When does it turn into a tramper service where it's non-scheduled? It's kind of flippant. It's, there's some structure, but it's changing so much that it's hard to rely on it. I don't think the 14% is significant enough to be that threshold, but just something that I've asked in the past. I've asked, I'm asking again today, just something to think about as we see some of these blank sailings. Some people have said that we're going to see continued blank sailings and maybe even more of an increase in the blank sailings because of the rate dropout on the spot market. So I've been watching these rate dropouts, especially on this show. Spot markets do not equal service contract rates. And so the service contracts are those contracts that are negotiated between the shipper and the carriers for the most part. And the spot markets don't automatically adjust, or the service contracts don't automatically adjust to the spot markets. We saw that on the way up, and then we're going to see that on the way down now. But on the way down with those spot markets, one way to artificially kind of affect those rates is by, limiting those sailings, and so therefore kind of limiting capacity. And in turn, the rates could potentially go up. I don't know, but what we're seeing, what is kind of being said out there is that we might see more blank sailings to try to help manage those dropouts of rates. Just a thought, watching this. So. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. We are continuing to review unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations provided by an ocean common carrier. So this was released. This is the first rule of the 3 rules under OSRA. This rule was released September 13th, 2022, just a couple months ago, and published by the Federal Register on September 21st, which then started the 30-day comment period. Like I said many times, just because the agency releases it doesn't mean that it's published immediately in the Federal Register, so there was a couple-day lag there. So the 30 days started on September 21st, which meant that comments were due October 21st. So that's been about 2 weeks now since comments have closed here. And, I covered this early on, and there were only 2 comments filed early on. And one of them was an extension of time to file comments. But remember, this rule is required to be finished up by December 16th. OSRA, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, created this mandate to the FMC to have this rule finished up. And so this rule is required to be finished up by December 16th. I mean, not long. A few days after the December 13th close-up period of the comments for the D&D. So don't be confused. You don't need to worry about the December 16th versus 13th, other than if you're filing comments for D&D, the 13th. Keep that in mind. You don't really need to worry about the 16th unless you want to see what the final proposed rule is coming out. Likely not going to be effective on publication. Likely there will be a 30-day lag between when it's published in the Federal Register and when the rules, if they come out with final rule actual language on December 16th, probably won't be effective until mid-January. But we'll see. We'll see, because there's a lot of comments here. So there were 27 comments actually ultimately filed. Last week we covered on By Land and By Sea here, we covered the Department of Justice's comments. They were advising on the benefits of precision in definitions. It was a really interesting review. I really encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. But today we're going to be covering a selection of the other comments filed. There's a lot of comments out there, so I just kind of hit some of the big ones, and not even big by value, just kind of big by association. So let's make sure everyone's on the same page here. So let's go through kind of the foundational, what is this rule all about? So it was the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, OSRA 22. We've talked about it a lot. Passed on June 16th, 2022, had a very long to-do list for the Federal Maritime Commission. So what happened in OSRA 22? I mean, a lot of stuff, right? We had the 13 items that were required of all invoices, immediately effective on signing. We had a request for information requirement for the Federal Maritime Commission to request for information about an emergency order. Still waiting on information on that. But then we also had OSRA directing the FMC to initiate some rulemakings. We've talked about these a lot. The 3 highly anticipated rulemakings were the unreasonable refusal to deal with respect to vessel space. That's what we're talking about today. Detention, demurrage, prohibited practices. That's what is going to be due December 13th. And then the third one that we have not had a lot of information about yet is unfair and unjust discriminatory methods. That one's I'm really interested to hear more about. Okay, so we're talking about unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. So the law from OSRA said the FMC, in consultation with the Commandant of the Coast Guard, shall initiate a rulemaking defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. And they also said, OSRA also said, that the FMC shall issue a final rule not later than 6 months after the date of enactment of this act. So enacted June 16th, they got to finish this up by December 16th. So the proposed rule is looking to do a few things. The FMC does a nice job of kind of going through where they want to go with this. They propose to define the elements necessary to establish a violation and the criteria it will consider in assessing reasonableness. They define vessel space accommodations. They basically say refusal to deal or negotiate does not lend itself to a general definition and instead must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. But they say, in general, refusal to deal or negotiate presumes that in order for there to be a refusal, there must be something to refuse. In other words, a party has attempted in good faith to engage in discussions with an ocean carrier for the purposes of obtaining vessel space accommodations. This good faith attempt is something more than one communication with no response or reply. The party must prove an actual refusal to even entertain the proposal or to engage in good faith discussions. So that's okay. So that's kind of how they're starting to define refusal to deal or negotiate. And I'm highlighting that this week. I didn't highlight that in the baseline discussion last week because of the comments that we're going to talk about here. The FMC also highlights reasonableness, saying that Reasonableness, case law indicates that reasonableness of the refusal to deal or negotiate has historically been interpreted broadly in this context, with courts deferring to the Commission's reading of the term in administering its statutes and regulations. And the FMC has previously found reasonable those decisions that are connected to a legitimate business decision or motivated by legitimate transportation factors. Reasonableness can be given its dictionary definition, but is judged on a case-by-case basis with particular attention paid to relevant circumstances. The Commission has said that a just and reasonable practice is one otherwise lawful, but not excessive and suited to the end in view. They also give an example of what is reasonable or unreasonable. The FMC says, for example, a common carrier's repeated refusal to respond to email or telephone requests for negotiations over an extended period of time may be viewed as an unreasonable method of shutting another party out. Great example. I think a lot of people out there are really frustrated by not being able to get a hold of somebody. Maybe not specifically to this refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space, but I think I've heard of it a lot. So there's also a burden shift of rationale for not accepting cargo to the carrier. The ocean common carrier must establish that its refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space, which in some cases results in a decision not to accept cargo, was reasonable. It's a burden shift, scooting over to the carrier, basically saying the carrier is now holds that burden of proving that it was reasonable, their decision was reasonable. The FMC also, I'm going to note a few things here. I'm going into further detail because we're getting into the weeds a little bit when we cover these comments that were filed. But reasonableness in business. The FMC says the Commission continues to acknowledge that its role is not to ensure that all interested parties get the same deal or make a certain profit. Rather, the Commission's role is to ensure that parties are not precluded from obtaining preferential treatment due to unreasonable or unjustly discriminatory reasons. They're saying it just can't be unreasonable or unjustly discriminatory reason. They're not saying that they're going to call winners and losers. They're saying there may be winners and losers. That's fine. But they do not want parties to be blocked out from obtaining preferential treatment due to unreasonable or unjustly discriminatory reasons. It has to do with the unjust or unreasonable. So the FMC continues, an ocean common carrier may be viewed as having acted reasonably in exercising its business discretion to proceed with a certain arrangement over another by taking into account such factors as profitability and compatibility with its business development strategy. So they're saying, look, the carrier can refuse the cargo, but they have to say that it's taking into account and it's part of the business discretion. And so, like I said, the FMC doesn't want to be calling winners and losers. I wanted to highlight that last sentence. I'm going to say it again. An ocean common carrier may be viewed as having acted reasonably in exercising its business discretion to proceed with a certain arrangement over another by taking into account such factors as profitability and compatibility with its business development strategy. I'm highlighting that because we don't often talk about that when we do the baseline. We did a lot more of a deep dive in this intro part. So we have 27 comments now. Look, and one was from the DOJ. Yes, the Department of Justice, that was last week. But what do some of the other comments say? So one that I wanted to highlight right off the bat is AgTC. So the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, AgTC, filed comments. They note that they represent the interests of the nation's food, farm, and fiber exporters who have been directly and adversely impacted by ocean carrier refusals to accept outbound export bookings. Thus, this rulemaking is of significant interest and concern, they say. So AgTC says that their members have been greatly impressed and appreciative of the FMC's proactive initiatives to implement OSRA, and specifically highlighted the D&D requirements outlined in OSRA to be effective upon signature of the law. So they said that they're happy with what the FMC's done and that they specifically highlight the D&D requirements outlined in OSRA. Well, OSRA was created by Congress, so I'm assuming that they're talking about the 13 invoice requirements that were enforceable upon signature of OSRA. Basically, we've talked about that before, the 13 different requirements that are now required on all detention demurrage invoices. The date demurrage started, D&D started, or detention or demurrage started, the date it ended, the rule that it's pointing to, the rate that it's based on, the overall invoice charge, the who's getting the invoice. Those are all part of the 13 requirements that were required as soon as OSRA was signed. The FMC really didn't have anything to do with that. I mean, maybe they were part of some of those discussions with Congress, but that's not an FMC. That's a statute that's directing the FMC to do things, not created by the FMC. Okay, so I mean, other than releasing an industry advisory confirming that that these were all effective upon signature, that is something that the FMC did. They released this industry advisory just saying, yes, these 13 requirements of OSRA, yeah, they're real, and they are effective upon signing. Look, it actually, that advisory, just to note, got a little bit of critique. Some people were actually asking why did the FMC even needed to release such a simple advisory. I really appreciated the advisory because there was a lot of confusion at the time, and the confirmation of the immediate upon signature was a very important clarification. Look, even if it was just confirmed what the industry actually already knew, it made it very clear that those 13 items that were outlined in OSRA were instantly effective. So, okay, so AgTC is giving the FMC praise for something that OSRA and Congress really did, but kind of gave praise to the FMC saying, well, we liked your industry advisory without totally saying it exactly that way. Okay, so maybe a little bit of misplaced praise, but I think it's nice to have praise, right? So I'm sure the FMC appreciated that. But so AgTC goes on to say, and I quote, so this is where they get a little, I'll just quote it. The current NPRM is an exception to this otherwise positive trend. The proposed rule misses the congressionally stated intent and purposes of the Shipping Act by a wide margin. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think that this NPRM was so terrible that it was an exception to the otherwise positive trend, and I don't think that it misses the congressionally stated intent and purpose of the Shipping Act generally. But, okay, let's see what they had to say here. So, I quote again, by including carriers' pursuit of profitability and compatibility with business development strategy as a reasonable basis upon which to refrain from accepting and carrying export cargo, the NPRM provides carriers a loophole large enough to sail a 22,000 TEU ship through with room to spare. It suggests a greater interest in promoting ocean carriers' profitability than in supporting the growth and development of U.S. exporters. Not only is the legal reasoning for this conclusion, as set forth in the NPRM, faulty, but we believe it is inconsistent with Congress's and the Commissioner's stated views. Yowza. So they don't like it. It sounds like they do not like this NPRM. They think that the loophole, the mentioning of the profitability and compatibility with business development strategy as a reasonable basis upon which to refrain from accepting cargo, they don't like that. Look, my take is that the FMC has left this open for case law to determine the precision that AgTC is insisting on here, right? They're kind of putting some guardrails. The FMC, as a general statement, makes it known that they're not going to call winners and losers from a business perspective. They wanted the market to actually have some say in the industry, and that's why they left business profits and business determinations as part of the rulemaking. At least that's how I read it. You know, they were providing these guardrails, and they're going to let the specifics really be determined through the case law. Okay, so we continue with the comments here. The NPRM does not appear to recognize the various means the carriers decline to carry export cargo. To do so, the terms deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space allocations must be defined. It should include decisions by carriers to refuse or cancel bookings, cut allocations, or delay roll export cargo. These are never negotiated. They are almost always sudden, arbitrary decisions, tardily communicated or not communicated by the carrier or carrier to the exporter at all. They are not negotiated, but these denials are equally devastating, if not more so, as they arrive with no notice. This rule must address this kind of dealing. It does not currently. Okay, so that is something I can get behind, and something that the DOJ actually kind of pointed out in their comments that we covered last week. DOJ was kind of saying that deal or negotiate shouldn't be couched as the same word, and further that they should have definitions as part of the rulemaking, at least more clear definitions instead of case by case. I like the FMC's approach of guardrails on the issue with case law to fill in these holes, but I think that this may be a suggestion to act on in the short term. I think not only the non-negotiated blankings, essentially, or not even blankings, but the non-pickup of the export cargo with no notice, it really isn't mentioned, and I think maybe that's partly what the FMC is kind of getting at here, but maybe it's worth a sentence or two, either in the discussion or maybe an actual line in the final rule text. As a final comment from AgTC, they suggest scrapping the whole endeavor and begin drafting anew. They don't like this rule at all. They recognize that the rule is required to be completed by December 16th, but they suggest that the FMC petition Congress for an extension. Look, I don't think all of that is necessary. I think that they're close. I think the FMC is close here, and I think that we'll see some discussion on case law filling in the specifics, because case law also gives the rule generally some ability to live. Look, it can adapt to changing industry environments, and what we saw these past 2 years are by no means usual. I guess my point is, why draft a rule that is so prescriptive with these last 2 years during the pandemic as the baseline, as the intention? It doesn't have lasting property. And that's the thing, that, these rulemakings aren't supposed to be reactionary necessarily, reactionary only if they're going to continue to solve and have some evergreenness to them. I think the FMC is on the right track, but the DOJ and AgTC's suggestions on further defining deal or negotiate is a good one. And certainly kind of expanding to have the no notice, not taking it export cargo. That's a big problem, and something worth for sure mentioning, because especially agriculture products, they might not have the time to sit there, and if it gets, maybe everything is just in time, and there might be some spoilage properties that if you don't take it for export, then you might have just killed that cargo, so to speak. It's not usually alive still, but you never know. There was one more area that I wanted to note from AgTC. They go into each section specifically with their inline responses. And AgTC says, generally carriers did not provide any advance notice, much less adequate notice of a booking cancellation, cargo acceptance, or rolling of export shipments. In some cases, the booking was canceled after the cargo container had been delivered into the marine terminal. Okay, so it's already in the port gates, the terminal gates. You think at that point it's just going to be moved over and put on the ship. In none of these instances did the carrier explain why rejection of bookings or rolling tendered exports was reasonable. Such explanation did not occur because there was no negotiation or deal with the customer. U.S.-based ocean carrier sales reps frequently had the unfortunate task of informing regular export customers that we've been told not to take any exports, or your allocation has been cut from 300 loads to 12. This information surprised the exporter customer, and there was no opportunity provided for discussion or negotiation. I continue on from AgTC's comments here. If the rule is to effectively address carrier refusal of export cargo, it must recognize that the most common form of export cargo rejection is not the result of formal negotiation or dealing. Towards the end, the Commission will need to define deal or negotiate to include any instance in which the carrier determines not to accept reasonably timed, safely tendered export cargoes. Per the NPRM, such instances should be deemed a situation where an ocean carrier categorically excludes U.S. exports from its backhaul trip that creates a presumption of unreasonable refusal to deal. Those are actually great points. It was a little overly inflammatory on its critiques of the FMC here, but I think that these are some areas that could be further refined, further defined, and probably included in the next round. I hope that the FMC gets past some of the initial, like I said, inflammatory language, and really kind of sees what AgTC is saying here. There is some good stuff, but that's an interesting perspective, and certainly an interesting problem that's happening with this export cargo, I'm interested to see if it still happens. This export cargo that's just being not taken, not picked up. I'm also going to highlight the World Shipping Council here. So that's kind of the other side of things, right? So the World Shipping Council is a nonprofit trade association that represents the liner shipping industry, which is comprised of operators of container ships and ro-ro vessels, roll on, roll off. So essentially the World Shipping Council, the WSC, represents the carriers and all of their interests. So arguably the other side of the argument here, right? So World Shipping Council, I'm going to quote from their comments as well. So WSC agrees with the Commission that allegations of unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and that using a suite of non-exclusive factors is both appropriate and consistent with its past precedent. This is the approach that the Commission has consistently used when adjudicating cases brought under the Shipping Act and its predecessors. It is important to remember in this regard that OSRA 22 did not create the unreasonable refusal to deal prohibition. Instead, OSRA 22 merely added language to the section by expressly naming vessel space accommodations as a factual situation to which the prohibition applies. Thus, adherence to past Commission precedent is required absent a reasoned explanation why its prior policies and standards are being changed. So there were a few changes that World Shipping Council is proposing here. And I'm going to kind of go through these. And this is an oversimplification of what their comments have. They were quite lengthy. But one of the things that they would like changed is eliminate or explain the export strategy language. So saying that the FMC has no authority to require such a document and gives no explanation of what is included in such a document. So the FMC is saying that there needs to be export strategy and documented export strategy. But, and I think that what the World Shipping Council is saying is, look, I think that's kind of fair. I think they're saying, look, I don't think that the FMC is asking for a formalized document, like a formal business proposal. Maybe they are. I mean, they're certainly kind of alluding that way. And if they are, that would be a change, and that would certainly require some more explanation. I think that they are kind of looking for general strategy. I mean, something that's more than just willy-nilly, right? I mean, they would like something that makes it a little bit harder for the carrier to just change their mind and say, oh, no, it was reasonable because we business decisions. They want more than that, and they're trying to get to that point of kind of massaging the language so that they can say, well, that's not good enough. We need something a little bit more. And so what I think the FMC is trying to say is, look, what's your strategy here? What's your general strategy? Try to root it in something like that. So World Shipping Council also says, delete that a common carrier cannot give special treatment to a party because they are a regular customer. World Shipping Council says that this is contrary to the confidential service contract provisions of OSRA 98. Okay, I agree that this could be further defined. I think the FMC meant that as a general across-the-board statement, you can't willy-nilly change plans based on preferential treatment. You can't say, look, we can't take your export because this guy is more important to us. But look, under OSRA 98, World Shipping Council is pointing out that you could make contracts that give preference to special customers, but that's a pre-negotiated, that's in the contract, that's determined in advance. But making those willy-nilly, we can't take you because we have more important, and then only taking the other guy because they're a special customer, I think that's what the FMC is trying to get at here. Maybe this would help with having a few more examples provided in the explanation from the FMC, basically saying, maybe they're not going to say willy-nilly, but I think maybe explaining that you can't just with no basis, well, it's unreasonable or unjust, change of plans on preferential treatment. Interesting. I like that they're pointing that out. Maybe it could use a little more refinement in the rule. Again, remember though, they only have till December 16th, and they really 6 months for this whole thing. That I've always said this was a beast of a discussion, and not to mention you also had detention to merge at the same time. So there's a lot going on at the FMC. I think that they did a pretty good job with their NPRM. Okay, so the next thing that World Shipping Council is saying is they want to expand enumerated legitimate business factors. Of course, they want more specifics on what is considered a business factor. This is another one of those case-by-case things. Perhaps the FMC could add a few more examples, but they've stated that these decisions are so fact-intensive and should be determined on a case-by-case basis. They would really be hard to list out too many examples, because then if you have too many examples, then it's like, well, these are the only examples. Are they not? That's a tough one. I think the case-by-case basis, they really want the case law to fill in the specifics here. They're just trying to provide some guardrails, and then they want that case law where you can really determine, is this example one that we think is reasonable or unreasonable? Is this example one that is unjust to fill in? So the last thing, certification for the carrier to rebut the unreasonableness claim. From the language of the NPRM, FMC was saying that submittal of evidence through a certified statement by a compliance officer or set forth what other methods carriers may use to provide rebuttal evidence. World Shipping Council wants more methods for producing that evidence. So with the burden shift over to the carriers to really say this was reasonable, one of the ways the FMC said was submittal of evidence through a certified statement by a compliance officer or set forth what other methods carriers may use to provide rebuttal evidence. That's what the World Shipping Council. If it's unclear, perhaps this could be made more clear. I think that the main point here is that the burden is shifting to the carriers to prove that it was reasonable, rather than the only burden being on the complainant, so the one bringing the case, usually the shipper, saying it was unreasonable. So you still have to establish your case. If you're bringing the case, you still have to establish your case by saying how you think it was unreasonable. So that's not going away by any means. But now the carrier has a significant piece in that by being required to prove that it was reasonable. And the World Shipping Council, I think, is asking for a little bit more flexibility in providing that evidence. It really comes down to, again, they don't want the carrier to just say, of course it was reasonable. They want a little bit more evidence behind that. I think they're also tagging on to this idea of the compliance officer, that all regulated entities may be required, have a compliance officer, an FMC compliance officer. That's been brought about before too. I mean, interesting. Certainly, they're asking for a little bit more definition in a lot of different areas here. There's one more comment that I did want to highlight, and we're running low on time. I mean, these are only, 2 plus this third one of comments plus the DOJ. That's only 4 of the 27 filed. So there's a lot to cover here. We're going to continue to cover it all. But one more comment for today that I wanted to cover is from the Meat Import Council of America and the North American Meat Institute. So MICA and NAMI. So these jointly filed comments represent the U.S. industry that imports fresh, chilled, and frozen beef and sheep meat into the U.S., as well as the oldest and largest trade association representing packers and processors of beef, pork, lamb, veal, turkey, and processed meat products, and account for more than 95% of U.S. output of these products. Okay, so the meat industry. So what did they say? They outlined the difficulties specific to the meat industry, and I'm going to quote from their comments. Because ocean carriers have established a pattern of skipping ports, canceling export bookings, and refusing to carry certain perishable meat and poultry exports, shippers have had to shift production from chilled to frozen product to account for longer transportation timelines, yielding significant financial implications as frozen product earns a lower premium than chilled meat. So, what they're saying is basically they've had chilled meat leaving, but because they don't really know if it's going to hop on the ship or not, they have to move it over to frozen, because at least then you have the less likely possibility that you have to just, it's going to be spoiled or you're going to have to toss your product there. And they're talking about the exports here. So the comments continue. However, really interestingly, nope, this is not where the comments continue. These are my notes. So really interestingly, these comments expand the discussion of reasonableness in refusal to deal, especially when the FMC mentions not picking up the phone or answering emails. MICA and NAMI talk about that as well. So they're talking about fresh to frozen and how these different things, these different activities of the carriers with the exports are affecting what they're able to export. But now they're actually, they go on in the continuation of the comments and they talk about a little bit of detention and demurrage. So the MICA and NAMI comments discuss the expansion of that definition standard of reasonableness to possibly maybe even be expanded to include detention and demurrage, deal and negotiate, saying that this example applies to detention and demurrage, and the impossibility of getting anyone to answer the phone or answer emails when seeking dispute resolution, could and maybe should be applied to detention and demurrage. It's a really interesting parallel to draw, and I actually hope that discussion, that comment will find its way over to detention and demurrage rulemaking. So again, the example provided by the FMC, the reasonableness, they talk about it's unreasonable to not answer your phone or answer emails. And they say not just one instance, but multiple. But if you can't get a hold of somebody to even start the negotiation, they're saying that's unreasonable. MICA and NAMI here is saying, isn't that also unreasonable for detention and demurrage? If we're going to call that unreasonable and that's going to be an example, and the same thing is happening on the D&D side, let's keep that definition of reasonable or unreasonable and move it over to D&D or include D&D or bring that same thought to the D&D rulemaking. Really interesting parallel. MICA and NAMI continues and discusses the reasonable business decisions language included by the FMC. We saw this a lot actually with the 27 comments. So MICA and NAMI say, furthermore, with the constructs of this proposed framework, NAMI and MICA believe that FMC's historical recognition of deference to a party's reasonable business decisions should be reconsidered. We are concerned that with this discretion, the FMC will default to the current status quo as common carriers will assert reasonable, not unreasonable, business decisions were made from the perspective of their own operations, and the FMC will ultimately defer to the current standard. I mean, they're basically saying, look, of course the carriers are going to say, oh, it was reasonable. This is just what we've always done. And Micah and Nami is saying, they're saying, look, this isn't what they've always done, and it shouldn't just be presumed to be reasonable. The comments continue. We believe the FMC needs to take an active role in determining what is in the public's interest versus the private interests of the common carrier, which, in our view, is what Congress intended in OSRA. So they continue to say, when finalizing this proposal, we recommend that the FMC clarify the Commission's position on deference or remove the reference altogether. An efficient, dependable transportation network has always been essential to America's agriculture economy and trade-dependent meat and poultry industry. A reliable, transparent ocean freight transportation system is crucial to this network, and the proposed rule, once finalized and implemented with identified changes, will curb some of the most egregious and costly practices perpetrated by ocean carriers. Commercial convenience, upon which ocean carriers have acted and which is expressly prohibited by this rule as justification for establishing reasonableness, has been the main impetus behind refusing the carriage of meat and poultry products in favor of consumer goods awaiting export from Asia to North America. The added oversight and associated requirements placed on ocean carriers around justifying reasonableness and engaging in good faith negotiations will not only yield important benefits for the carriage of meat and poultry imports and exports, but will also improve related factors including communication, information sharing, equipment availability, and terminal and cold storage space. I mean, I think that they make some really good points here. I think, cleaning this up is going to benefit across the board. And so, again, I think that the FMC is doing a good job of trying to identify reasonable business decisions as basically saying, look, we're not going to call winners and losers. We're not going to require carriers to take a loss, and we're not going to require them to take each and every export out there. That's why they're saying the reasonable business decisions. But I think maybe the FMC could be a little bit more prescriptive there. Going back to the AgTC comments saying, look, you can't just deny it, especially if it's already there and ready to be loaded. You can't just deny it as an export unless it's rooted in maybe a real operational decision or maybe they say like a true solid business. I don't know what language you're going to use, but I think that there probably could be a little bit more refinement there. I think the FMC has a lot to chew on here before the final rule is released December 16th. There's some good points made not only here, but also by DOJ and really the other 20 plus comments that we haven't even discussed yet here on By Land and By Sea. I'm going to keep walking through them as I can, so stay tuned and make sure to join us every week. There's some really great comments. Look at them yourself. For sure, go review them yourself. I'll keep trying to break them down before we hit the December 16th final rule, just so we kind of know what's going on and what's likely coming. And then we'll get to kind of play the little game of like what was in it, what wasn't, what did the FMC acknowledge, what did they acknowledge but continue on with. Look, as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, for the e-learning and general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any of my previous episodes, check them out on the podcast, By Land and By Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and By Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. While you're at it, check out the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. Our e-courses are dropping soon. So until next week, this is Lauren Beegan, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea. See you next time.